The morning mist clung to the valley like smoke from a dying fire as Deborah Sanchez knelt beside the broken fence line, her weathered fingers tracing the clean cut through the wire. 30 yards away, hoofprints told a story written in mud and torn grass. 5 men, 4 horses carrying double weight, and the tracks of Black Thunder, her prized stallion, being led away against his will. She rose slowly, steel gray eyes following the trail that disappeared into the pine-covered ridges above her homestead. The men who had taken her horse had no idea what they had just awakened. 3 days earlier, Deborah had been just another widow trying to make a living training horses in the Montana Territory. The locals in Cedar Falls knew her as a quiet woman who kept to herself, worked harder than most men, and had a way with difficult animals that bordered on magic. What they did not know was that before she became Mrs. Deborah Sanchez, before she settled into this peaceful valley with her late husband Marcus, she had been Sergeant Deborah Hayes of the United States Army, one of the finest marksmen and trackers the frontier had ever produced. Now, as she studied the churned earth where her stallion had fought his captors, that old identity stirred like embers touched by wind. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. This widow is about to remind some very foolish men that taking the wrong horse can be a fatal mistake. The story had begun 4 mornings ago with the kind of routine that had defined Deborah's life for the past 3 years since Marcus passed. She rose before dawn, checked the horses in the corral, and walked the fence line that marked the boundaries of their small ranch. The mountains stood silent and majestic in the pre-dawn darkness, and the only sounds were the soft nickering of horses and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Black Thunder had greeted her at the gate as so he always did, the magnificent stallion pressing his velvet nose against her palm in search of the sugar cube she always carried. He was more than just a horse to her. He was the last gift Marcus had given her before the fever took him, a wild Mustang they had gentled together during their final summer. The horse represented everything good about their life in this valley, everything worth protecting. That morning had felt different, though she could not have said why. Perhaps it was the way the birds seemed quieter than usual, or the fact that her old instincts, dormant for years, suddenly prickled with unease. She found herself checking sight lines and escape routes without conscious thought, her hand drifting to the Colt 45 she still wore beneath her work coat. The first sign of trouble came when she rode into Cedar Falls for supplies. The town was buzzing with nervous energy, and she quickly learned why. A gang of rustlers had been working their way through the territory, hitting isolated ranches and homesteads. They were professional, organized, and ruthless. Unlike the usual drifters and desperados who plagued the frontier, these men operated with military precision. Timothy Ramos, the town sheriff, had pulled her aside with genuine concern. "You need to be careful out there, Deborah," he had said. "These men are not ordinary thieves. They take what they want and leave no witnesses. Maybe you should stay in town for a while." She had thanked him politely and loaded her supplies onto her wagon. But even as she drove home through the mountain passes, her mind was already shifting into patterns of thought she had not used in years. She found herself cataloging defensive positions, counting ammunition, and planning fields of fire from her cabin windows. That night, she had done something she had not done since Marcus died. She opened the locked chest beneath their bed and looked at the contents she had hoped never to need again. Her army badge, tarnished but still bearing the crossed rifles of the infantry. Her custom Winchester rifle, the one that had never missed its target in 3 tours of duty, and the leather-bound journal where she had recorded every mission, every successful hunt, every dangerous man she had tracked across the wilderness. The next morning brought the discovery that changed everything. The broken gate, the missing horse, and the arrogant message carved into the wooden fence post. Quote, the words were signed with a crude drawing of a snake, the calling card of the serpent gang that had been terrorizing the territory. Deborah stood in her doorway, coffee growing cold in her hands, as she studied the trail left by the thieves. 5 men, she confirmed, reading the signs with eyes that had once tracked Apache war parties across desert badlands. 4 horses, one of them carrying double weight, which meant they had a pack animal or an injured man. And Black Thunder, his distinctive hoof prints clear in the soft earth, being led on a rope behind the group. The trail headed northeast toward the high passes, rough country where a woman alone would be expected to give up the chase. These men had clearly chosen their target carefully. A widow with no family, no protection, and no apparent means of pursuit. They had made the same mistake that had gotten so many men killed during her army days. They had underestimated their opponent. She finished her coffee and went back inside to prepare. From the hidden chest came items that had not seen daylight in 3 years. The Winchester, its action smooth as silk despite years of storage. A cavalry saber that Marcus had never known she owned. Field glasses that had belonged to her father, a Union scout during the war. And finally, the thing she had hoped never to touch again. Her sniper's journal, filled with range calculations and wind readings that had made her legendary among the frontier scouts. As she cleaned and checked the rifle, muscle memory took over. Her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a professional soldier, and she found herself falling back into the mental state that had kept her alive through campaigns against hostile tribes and desperate outlaws. The widow Deborah Sanchez was fading, replaced by Sergeant Hayes, the woman they had once called the Ghost of the Rockies. The trail was not difficult to follow at first. The thieves had made no effort to hide their passage, confident that no pursuit would come from a lone woman. They had ridden hard through the night, pushing toward the mountain passes that would take them out of the territory and beyond the reach of local law. But they had not counted on being followed by someone who could read sign-like scripture and move through wilderness like smoke. Deborah packed light and moved fast, her horse picking its way up narrow game trails that paralleled the main route. She stayed off the obvious paths, using skills learned from Apache guides to remain invisible while keeping her quarry in sight. By midday, she had closed the distance enough to see smoke from their campfire rising above the tree line. She dismounted a quarter-mile from their position and moved forward on foot, the Winchester cradled in her arms like an old friend. Through her field glasses, she studied the men who had made the mistake of stealing from her. They were professionals, all right, but they were also arrogant. They had posted no sentries and chosen a campsite that offered multiple approaches for an attacker. The leader was a big man with a scarred face and the bearing of an ex-soldier. David Wright, she realized, recognizing him from wanted posters in the sheriff's office. A former cavalry sergeant turned outlaw, wanted for murder and robbery across 3 territories. The kind of man who would take what he wanted and kill anyone who tried to stop him. Black Thunder stood tied to a picket line with their other horses, his coat lathered with sweat and his eyes rolling white with stress. The sight of her horse's distress ignited something cold and deadly in Deborah's chest. These men had not just stolen her property, they had hurt something she loved. She settled into a shooting position behind a fallen log, the rifle's familiar weight solid against her shoulder. 400 yards to the camp, with a slight crosswind from the west. An easy shot for someone with her skills, but she held her fire. Not yet. First, she needed to know if there were more of them, and she needed to get Black Thunder clear of the line of fire. As she watched, one of the men approached her stallion with a lead rope, clearly intending to move the horses. Black Thunder reared and struck, his hooves flashing in the afternoon sun, and the man stumbled backward with a curse. Good boy, she thought. Make them work for it. The man, angry now, drew his pistol and pointed it at the horse's head. That was when Deborah Sanchez disappeared entirely, replaced by the cold professional who had once been the most feared sniper on the frontier. The shot took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the brush. The crack of the Winchester echoed through the mountains like thunder, and suddenly the peaceful afternoon exploded into chaos. The remaining 4 men scattered like quail, diving for cover behind rocks and trees as they tried to locate the source of the shot. Deborah had already moved, flowing through the forest with the silent grace that had earned her legendary status among frontier scouts. She had learned long ago that the first shot was just the beginning. After that, it was all about movement and positioning. David Wright's voice boomed across the campsite, harsh with authority and growing alarm. "Where are you? You coward! Show yourself!" Deborah smiled grimly as she settled into a new position 60 yards to the east of her original spot. Men like Wright never learned. They thought volume and bluster could substitute for tactical thinking. She had dealt with his type before during the Indian Wars, when overconfident cavalry officers had led their men into ambushes because they could not believe a woman might outthink them. Through her rifle scope, she could see Wright gesturing angrily to his remaining men, Ethan Peterson and Stephen Taylor, according to the wanted posters she had memorized. Both were known killers, but they were also city men who had learned their trade in saloons and back alleys. They knew nothing about fighting in wilderness terrain against an opponent who had grown up in these mountains. "You made a mistake coming after us, lady," Wright called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "We are not some drunken cowboys you can scare off. We are professionals." Deborah's second shot shattered a branch 2 inches from Wright's head, showering him with bark and pine needles. She had deliberately missed, but the message was clear. She could have killed him easily and chose not to. Yet, "The next one will not miss," she called back, her voice calm and steady. "Release my horse and ride away. This is your only warning." Wright's laughter was ugly and full of menace. March 6. That was his second mistake. The first had been stealing Black Thunder. The second was threatening her directly. Deborah had given him a chance to leave with his life, and he had thrown it back in her face. Now the rules changed. She began to move through the forest like a hunting wolf, using every piece of cover to close the distance to their camp. Her moccasins made no sound on the pine needles, and her earth-colored clothing blended perfectly with the shadows between the trees. This was what she had been trained for during her years with the Army Scouts, moving unseen through hostile territory to gather intelligence or eliminate threats. Peterson made the mistake of trying to flank her position, moving clumsily through the underbrush with his rifle held high. Deborah heard him coming long before she saw him, his city boots snapping twigs and his breathing harsh with exertion. She let him pass within 10 feet of her hiding spot, then rose like a ghost behind him. "Quote 7, she said quietly. Peterson spun around, his face white with shock at finding her so close. For a moment he seemed to consider trying for a quick shot, but something in her gray eyes convinced him otherwise. The rifle fell from his nerveless fingers. "Don't," Deborah said. "Could. Peterson stumbled away through the trees, crashing through the brush like a spooked elk. She let him go, knowing that his panic would do more damage to their morale than another bullet. Fear was a weapon, and she wielded it as expertly as her rifle. The afternoon wore on, and Deborah continued her deadly game of cat and mouse with the remaining outlaws. She appeared and disappeared like smoke, taking shots that missed by inches, leaving signs of her presence in places that should have been impossible to reach. She was not trying to kill them yet. She was breaking their early will to fight, making them understand that they were facing something far beyond their experience. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Wright finally made his decision. Quote, he ordered his men, quote, but it was too late for a clean escape. Deborah had spent the afternoon not just stalking them, but also studying their horses and equipment. She knew which animal each man favored, how much ammunition they carried, and most importantly, which routes they would likely choose for their retreat. As the outlaws broke camp and prepared to flee, Deborah made her way to a rocky outcrop that commanded a view of the main trail down from the high country. It was a position she had used before, during the Indian Wars, when she had been tasked with stopping war parties from reaching the settlements below. The range was long, nearly 600 yards, but the sight lines were perfect. She settled the Winchester against a steady rest and began her calculations. Wind speed, target movement, the way the evening light would affect her aim. These were computations she had made hundreds of times before, and her hands moved with unconscious precision as she adjusted the rifle's sights. Black Thunder was still with them, being led on a rope behind Wright's horse. The stallion looked exhausted and stressed, but he was unharmed. That was about to change everything. Wright led his remaining men down the narrow trail in single file. Their horses picking their way carefully over the rocky ground. They thought they were safe now, beyond the range of pursuit. They had no idea that death was watching them through a telescopic sight, calculating the precise moment to strike. Deborah's finger found the trigger as Wright's horse stepped into the perfect position. Not Wright himself, not yet. First, she would cut the rope that held Black Thunder, and then she would see how brave these men were when their escape route disappeared. The shot was perfect, the bullet severing the lead rope as cleanly as a knife cut. Black Thunder reared in surprise, then wheeled and bolted back up the trail, free at last. The sudden movement spooked the other horses, and for a moment the narrow path was filled with plunging, frightened animals. Quote, Taylor shouted, fighting to control his mount. Wright's answer was a string of curses that echoed off the canyon walls. He had finally realized what he was facing. The woman tracking them was not some desperate widow armed with her husband's old hunting rifle. She was a professional, someone with military training and the skills to use it. Quote 13, Peterson said, his voice tight with fear. Quote 14, quote Withain, Wright snarled, but Deborah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake, but his pride would not let him admit it. As darkness fell over the mountains, the outlaws made camp in a defensive position among a cluster of boulders. They posted sentries and kept their weapons close, but Deborah could see the fear in their movements. They jumped at every sound, started at every shadow. They were no longer predators. They had become prey. She spent the night moving around their position like a circling wolf, letting them catch glimpses of her, but never offering a clear shot. She would appear for a moment at the edge of their firelight, then vanish before they could react. She left small signs of her presence, a pebble that had not been there before, a broken twig arranged in a pattern that could not be natural. Footprints in the soft earth just outside their perimeter. By morning, the men were haggard and exhausted, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. They had not slept, afraid to close their eyes while death stalked them in the darkness. Wright's authority was cracking, and his men were beginning to question his leadership. We need to split up, Taylor suggested. She cannot follow all of us. No, Wright said, but his voice lacked conviction. We stay together. Safety in numbers. Deborah watched their debate through her field glasses, reading their lips and body language. They were falling apart just as she had intended. Fear was doing her work for her, breaking down their cohesion and turning them against each other. As the sun climbed higher, Wright finally made his decision. We are going back, he announced, back to settle this once and for all. It was exactly what Deborah had been waiting for. She had driven them to this point, forced them to abandon their escape route and come to her on ground of her choosing. Now the real hunt could begin. The outlaws rode back up the mountain trail with the grim determination of men who knew they were walking into a trap but saw no other choice. Wright had finally accepted that running was impossible. The woman hunting them knew these mountains too well, and she had already demonstrated that distance was no protection against her rifle. Their only hope was to force a confrontation and try to overwhelm her with superior numbers. Deborah watched them come from her position high above the trail, a rocky ledge that offered perfect concealment and multiple escape routes. She had chosen this spot carefully, remembering lessons learned during her army days about the importance of controlling the high ground. Below her, the trail wound through a narrow canyon with steep walls on both sides. It was a perfect killing ground, but she was not ready to kill them yet, not all of them. Wright and his men had made their choice when they decided to become thieves and killers, but she wanted them to understand exactly what they had brought down on themselves. She wanted them to know who was destroying them and why. As the riders entered the canyon, Deborah stood up on her ledge and let them see her clearly for the first time. She was a small figure against the vast backdrop of stone and sky, but there was something in her stance that spoke of absolute confidence. She held her rifle casually, like a woman might hold a walking stick, but every line of her body radiated deadly competence. "David Wright," she called down, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You and your men have something that belongs to me." Wright reined in his horse and stared up at her, his scarred face twisted with anger and grudging respect. "So you finally show yourself. I was beginning to think you were a ghost." "I might as well be," Deborah replied, "for all the good it will do you." "You talk big for a woman alone," Wright said, "but you are still just one person against four. Those are not good odds." Deborah's smile was cold as winter wind. Code 29, Stephen Taylor shifted nervously in his saddle, his hand moving toward his pistol. Quote 30. Quote 30 in, Deborah asked. She raised her rifle in one smooth motion and fired without seeming to aim. Taylor's hat flew from his head, the bullet passing so close that it singed his hair. The shot echoed like thunder in the confined space, and the horses danced nervously as the sound bounced back and forth between the canyon walls. "The next one will not miss," she said calmly, already working the lever to chamber another round. "Unless you give me back what you stole." Wright's face was pale, but his voice remained steady. Quote 34. Quote 30, Deborah said, ye quote, quote, Wasi, Wright demanded, quote, Wasi, quote, Deborah said, quote, Fama. The name hit Wright like a physical blow. Even Peterson and Taylor, city men with limited knowledge of frontier legends, had heard stories about the ghost. The Army scout who could track anything that moved, who never missed a shot, who had single-handedly broken up war parties and outlaw gangs across the Western Territories. Quote 41, Wright said, but his voice cracked on the words. Quote 40, Deborah asked. Quote 40, Wright's face went white. That had been one of the worst experiences of his criminal career. 3 days of being hunted through the wilderness by someone who seemed to know his every move before he made it. He had never learned the identity of the scout who had nearly destroyed his gang. But now he knew. It was you, he whispered. It was me, Deborah confirmed. And now you have made the same mistake twice. You have taken something that belongs to me, and you think you can ride away without consequences. The standoff stretched for long minutes, the only sounds the whisper of wind through the canyon and the nervous stamping of horses. Wright's men were looking to him for leadership, but she could see the doubt in their eyes. They had signed on to rob isolated homesteads and defenseless travelers, not to face a legendary army scout in her own territory. Quote 47, Wright finally asked. Quote, Deborah said simply, quote, quote, Deborah's smile was like the edge of a blade. Then I will hunt you down one by one, just like I did during the war. I will track you to whatever hole you crawl into, and I will finish what you started when you broke down my fence. Peterson broke first, his nerve finally snapping under the pressure. Right, this is insane. She is just one woman. Let us rush her and be done with it. He spurred his horse forward, drawing his pistol as he charged up the narrow trail toward Deborah's position. It was exactly the kind of foolish bravery that had gotten so many men killed during her army days, and she dealt with it the same way she always had. The Winchester spoke once, and Peterson tumbled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. His horse bolted back down the trail, leaving him sprawled on the rocky ground, very much alive, but thoroughly discouraged from further heroics. Quote 53, Deborah said calmly, working the lever to chamber another round. Quote 54, Wright stared at his wounded man, then back up at the woman on the ledge. He was beginning to understand that this was not a negotiation. It was a reckoning. The ghost of the Rockies had emerged from retirement, and she was offering him one chance to avoid complete destruction. Quote 55, he said finally. Quote 56, quote 57. Deborah said, quote Dian, quote quotation, she said, quote intern. Raibwad looked at his remaining men, reading the fear in their faces. Taylor was white as paper, and Peterson was groaning on the ground, his shoulder dark with blood. They were finished as a gang, broken by one woman with a rifle and the skills to use it. Quote 62, Wright said. Quote Charner and quote Deborah replied. Quote 60, she melted back into the rocks like smoke, disappearing so completely that it seemed she had never been there at all. The outlaws were left alone in the canyon with their wounded companion and the echoing memory of her voice. Wright dismounted and helped Peterson back onto his horse, his hands shaking slightly as he bound the man's wound. He had faced Apache warriors and cavalry charges, but nothing had prepared him for the cold professionalism of the woman who had just destroyed his gang without even breathing hard. Let us get out of here, Taylor whispered, before she changes her mind. They rode out of the canyon in defeat, leaving behind their reputation and their confidence. The Serpent Gang was finished, broken by a widow who had turned out to be anything but defenseless. Deborah watched them go from her hidden position among the rocks, her rifle ready in case they decided to make one last desperate play. But she could see the defeat in their posture, the way they hunched in their saddles like beaten dogs. They would not be back. Fear had done its work, and they understood now that they had awakened something they could not hope to control. When they were finally out of sight, she made her way down to the canyon floor and began following the trail north toward their abandoned camp. Black Thunder would be waiting for her there, probably confused and frightened but unharmed. The outlaws had been many things, but they were not stupid enough to damage valuable livestock. The walk gave her time to think about what had just happened and what it meant for her carefully constructed new life. For 3 years, she had been simply Deborah Sanchez, the quiet widow who trained horses and minded her own business. But that identity had been shattered the moment she picked up her rifle and became the ghost again. The people of Cedar Falls would hear about this, of course. News traveled fast in small communities, and the story of how their local horse trainer had single-handedly faced down the Serpent Gang would spread like wildfire. Some would be impressed, others frightened. All would see her differently now, but perhaps that was not such a bad thing. She had spent 3 years trying to bury her past, to pretend that Sergeant Hayes had never existed. But the truth was that both identities were part of who she was. The skills that had made her legendary as an Army Scout were the same ones that had helped her build a successful horse training business. The discipline and attention to detail that had kept her alive in combat had made her one of the finest ranchers in the territory. She found their camp exactly where Wright had said it would be, a trampled clearing beside a small stream where they had spent the previous night. Black Thunder stood tied to a picket line with their other horses, his head raised alertly as she approached. When he saw her, he nickered softly and trotted to the end of his rope, clearly relieved to see a familiar face. "Easy, boy," she murmured, running her hands over his legs and flanks to check for injuries. "It is all over now. Time to go home." The stallion was tired and stressed, but otherwise unharmed. She untied him from the picket line and swung up onto his bare back, feeling the familiar surge of joy that came from being reunited with a beloved companion. Whatever else had happened over the past few days, she had accomplished her primary objective. Black Thunder was safe. The ride back to her homestead took most of the afternoon, following familiar trails through country that had been her sanctuary for the past 3 years. But as she rode, she found herself seeing the landscape with different eyes. Not just as a peaceful valley where she could live quietly, but as terrain to be defended. Sightlines and fields of fire, defensive positions, and escape routes. The tactical awareness that had been dormant for so long was fully awake now, and she knew it would never sleep again. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, she crested the final ridge and saw her homestead spread out below. The cabin where she and Marcus had shared so many happy evenings, the corrals where she had built her horse training business, the fence line that marked the boundaries of their small piece of paradise. But now she also saw the weaknesses in her defenses, the approaches that an enemy could use, the improvements she would need to make if she wanted to be truly secure. The widow's sanctuary had become the ghost fortress, and she would need to plan accordingly. Sheriff Timothy Ramos was waiting for her when she rode into the yard, his horse tied to the hitching post outside her cabin. He rose from the porch steps as she dismounted, his weathered face creased with concern and something that might have been awe. "Deborah," he said quietly, "we need to talk." She nodded and led Black Thunder to the corral, taking her time with the familiar routine of unsaddling and brushing the stallion. Ramos waited patiently, understanding that some conversations could not be rushed. When she finally joined him on the porch, he was holding 2 cups of coffee that he had apparently made himself using her kitchen. It was a presumption that would have annoyed her from anyone else. But Ramos was an old friend who had earned certain privileges. "The Peterson boy rode into town about an hour ago," he said without preamble. "Shoulder wound, scared out of his wits, babbling about ghosts and impossible shots. Took me a while to get the whole story out of him." "And what story did he tell?" Deborah asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "He said that a woman with a rifle had destroyed the Serpent Gang single-handed, picked them off one by one like they were targets at a county fair. Said she knew things about their past that no one should know, moved through the mountains like smoke, and shot like the devil himself." Deborah sipped her coffee and said nothing. "Of course, most folks would dismiss that as the ravings of a wounded man," Ramos continued. "But I have been sheriff in this territory for 15 years, and I remember stories about an Army Scout they called the Ghost of the Rockies, woman who could track anything that moved and never missed a shot. Heard she disappeared a few years back, married some rancher, and settled down somewhere." "Interesting story," Deborah said. "Peterson also mentioned that this mysterious woman claimed to be someone named Sergeant Hayes. That name mean anything to you?" Deborah met his eyes steadily. "Should it?" Ramos smiled slightly. "I suppose that depends on whether you want it to. See, the way I figure it, if such a person existed and if she had chosen to retire and live quietly in my territory, I would consider that a blessing. The kind of person who might be very useful to have around when trouble comes calling. And if trouble has already been dealt with, then I would say that the citizens of Cedar Falls owe someone a considerable debt of gratitude. The Serpent Gang has been terrorizing this territory for months. If they have suddenly decided to seek opportunities elsewhere, well, that would be the best news I have heard all year. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the western peaks. Finally, Ramos set down his cup and stood to leave. "One more thing," he said. "There is talk of organizing a territorial militia, what with all the trouble we have been having with outlaws and such. Could use someone with experience to help train the volunteers. Know anyone who might be interested?" Deborah considered the offer. It would mean acknowledging her past publicly, stepping out of the shadows she had inhabited for the past 3 years. But it would also mean using her skills to protect the community that had become her home. "I might know someone," she said finally. "Good," Ramos said. "I will be in touch." After he left, Deborah sat alone on her porch, listening to the night sounds of the mountains and thinking about the choice she faced. She could try to retreat back into her widow's identity, pretend that the past few days had never happened. But she knew that was impossible now. The ghost of the Rockies had awakened, and she could not be put back to sleep. The truth was that she had never really stopped being Sergeant Hayes. The skills, the instincts, the tactical awareness had all been there, just waiting for the right moment to emerge. Her years of peace with Marcus had not erased her past. They had simply given her something worth fighting for. Over the next few weeks, word of the Serpent Gang's sudden departure spread throughout the territory, along with increasingly elaborate stories about how they had been driven off. Some claimed it was the work of a mysterious gunfighter. Others insisted that an army patrol had finally caught up with them. But in Cedar Falls, those who knew Deborah best began to notice small changes in her behavior. She still ran her horse training business with the same quiet competence as before, but now she also spent time at the sheriff's office, helping to organize the new territorial militia. She taught marksmanship to volunteers who had never held a rifle, showed them how to read tracks and sign, and shared hard-won knowledge about tactics and strategy. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. The widow who had kept to herself was becoming a leader in the community, someone people turned to when they needed advice about security and defense. She never spoke directly about her past, but her expertise was obvious to anyone with eyes to see. Helen Diaz, who ran the general store, was the first to voice what many were thinking. Code 89, Myron. She told anyone who would listen. Quote 90. But if people had questions about Deborah's background, they were polite enough not to ask them directly. The frontier had always been a place where a person's past was their own business, and results mattered more than credentials. What mattered was that the territory felt safer with her around. The militia training sessions became popular community events, drawing volunteers from throughout the region. Deborah taught them to shoot accurately, move quietly, and work together as a unit. But more importantly, she taught them to think tactically, to see their familiar landscape as a battlefield that could be defended. She would tell her students. Quote 92. Nancy Jones, whose husband had been killed by outlaws the previous year, was among the most dedicated students. Quote 93, she admitted. Quote 94. The training paid off sooner than anyone expected. In late autumn, a new gang tried to rob the bank in Cedar Falls, apparently unaware that the territory's reputation for easy targets was no longer accurate. They rode into town expecting to face a handful of frightened shopkeepers, and instead found themselves confronting a well-organized militia that knew exactly what it was doing. The fight was brief and decisive. The would-be robbers found themselves caught in a carefully planned crossfire, with escape routes blocked and superior numbers arrayed against them. Two surrendered immediately, one fled on foot into the wilderness, and the fourth made the mistake of trying to shoot his way out. Deborah's rifle spoke once from her position on the roof of the general store, and the outlaw toppled from his saddle with a shoulder wound that ended his resistance without ending his life. It was a shot that impressed even the militia members who had been training with her for months. Quote 95, marveled David Wright, no relation to the outlaw leader who served as the militia's unofficial second-in-command. I have never seen shooting like that. Practice, Deborah said simply, but there was satisfaction in her voice. Lots and lots of practice. As winter settled over the territory, bringing snow to the high peaks and ice to the streams, Deborah found herself settling into a new routine that balanced her old life with her new responsibilities. She still trained horses and maintained her homestead, but now she also served as the unofficial military advisor to Sheriff Ramos and the official commander of the Cedar Falls militia. It was a role that felt natural to her, drawing on skills and experience that had been dormant for too long. She enjoyed teaching the volunteers, sharing knowledge that had been hard-won through years of frontier service. And she took pride in the fact that her community was no longer seen as easy prey by the criminal elements that plagued the territory. The transformation was not just in her external circumstances, but in her internal sense of identity. For 3 years, she had tried to be only Deborah Sanchez, the quiet widow who wanted nothing more than to live in peace. But the confrontation with the Serpent Gang had shown her that peace was not something that could be taken for granted. It had to be defended, and she was uniquely qualified to do the defending. Marcus would have understood, she thought, during the long winter evenings when she sat by her fire cleaning weapons and planning defensive strategies. He had known about her past when he married her, had seen the scars and the nightmares that came with her military service, but he had also seen the strength and competence that made her legendary among frontier scouts. "You are not just a soldier," he had told her once. "You are a protector. That is what makes you special." Now she was protecting again, but in a different way. Instead of hunting hostile war parties across empty wilderness, she was building something positive. A community that could defend itself. A place where decent people could live without fear. The spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Word of the Cedar Falls militia's effectiveness had spread throughout the territory, and other communities began asking for Deborah's help in organizing their own defenses. She found herself traveling regularly, teaching marksmanship and tactics to farmers and shopkeepers who had never imagined they might need such skills. It was during one of these trips that she encountered Karen Hall, a young widow whose husband had been killed in an outlaw raid the previous year. Karen had a natural aptitude for shooting and an intense desire to learn everything Deborah could teach her. "I want to be like you," Karen said after a particularly successful training session. "I want to be someone that the bad men fear." Deborah studied the younger woman carefully, seeing something of her own younger self in Karen's fierce determination. "It is not about being feared," she said finally. "It is about being competent, about knowing that when trouble comes, you will be ready for it." "Will you teach me?" Karen asked. "Really teach me, not just the basic militia training?" Deborah considered the request. Karen had the potential to become truly skilled, but that kind of training would require a commitment that went far beyond weekend militia exercises. It would mean passing on knowledge that had been earned through years of dangerous service. "Are you sure?" she asked. "The kind of training you are talking about changes you. Once you learn to see the world through a warrior's eyes, you can never go back to being innocent." "I lost my innocence when they killed my husband," Karen replied. "Now I want to gain something else." And so Deborah began training her first true protege, passing on the skills and knowledge that had made her legendary. It felt like completing a circle, ensuring that the ghost of the Rockies would not disappear when she was gone. As summer returned to the territory, bringing green grass to the meadows and wildflowers to the mountain slopes, Deborah reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning when she discovered her broken fence and missing horse. She was no longer trying to hide from her past or pretend to be someone she was not. She was Deborah Sanchez, widow and horse trainer. She was also Sergeant Hayes, the ghost of the Rockies. Both identities were real, both were important, and both were part of who she had always been. The territory was safer because of her presence, and she had found a new purpose that honored both her past service and her present life. She had learned that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of those willing to defend it. And on quiet evenings when she sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, she knew that Marcus would have been proud of the choice she had made. She was still the woman he had fallen in love with, but she was also something more. A guardian, a teacher, and a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who look the most harmless. The ghost of the Rockies had returned, and the territory was better for it.